Hi, my name is David McCartney. I am an addiction doctor and I chair the Scottish Government's Residential Rehab Working Group. And this short presentation is going to address the definition of terms that we use to describe the problems associated with drinking, what the science tells us about dependence, why the behaviours associated with alcohol use disorders, and particularly dependence, are so peculiar and difficult to change. And finally, what kind of interventions, both professional and non-professional, are associated with change. So first of all, some terminology. Firstly, acute intoxication, and this term describes the kind of altered consciousness, judgment and different behaviours that result from excess alcohol. And it goes without saying that intoxication can result in significant adverse consequences to self and, crucially, to others. Harmful use describes a pattern resulting in negative impact on mental or physical health and harm to others again from the behaviours associated with drinking. Dependence we're going to go into in the next slide, but alcohol use disorder covers the whole spectrum of presentations from relatively minor problems all the way through to dependence. And the more problematic, the more likely the risk of serious consequences developing. So, the World Health Organization sets out a cluster of phenomena which are used in the diagnosis of alcohol dependence. But not all of these things are needed to make the diagnosis. There's a combination of things which creates that diagnosis. However, several of these things can be present. There's often a strong desire to drink. There's a loss of control. People end up drinking more than they planned to drink, or they drink when they're definitely planning not to drink, and they have difficulty stopping when they start drinking. And then probably one of the most critical things in the definition of dependence is this drinking despite negative consequences. So normally when negative consequences accrue from behaviours, we change the behaviour because the consequences are painful. That doesn't happen in dependence. People continue to drink despite these negative consequences. Alcohol begins to assume a higher priority above other things in life, even things that are normally important, like looking after your family or your work. And then there's increased tolerance, which simply means that you have to drink more to get the same effect. And then sometimes you can also get withdrawal, but you don't need to have that necessarily for a dependence diagnosis. So alcohol withdrawal describes the physical and psychological symptoms that people experience when they suddenly reduce or stop the amount of alcohol they're drinking if they have previously been drinking excessively for prolonged periods of time. And the removal of a sedative drug, alcohol, results in a flood of excitatory neurotransmitters in the brain. And this results in agitation, you get trembling, you get sweating, you can get vomiting. Blood pressure goes up, pulse goes up. And complications of withdrawal can include things like seizures, delirium tremens, something called Wernicke's encephalopathy, which is a condition which can lead to dementia, even in young people. Risks include things like this dementia, neurological damage, and death. Alcohol withdrawal can be serious. It's got a significant mortality. So people should not stop drinking suddenly. Management of withdrawal is withdrawals called benzodiazepines. They're sedatives. We need to monitor people that are withdrawing. They're often given B vitamin injections to prevent neurological complications. Withdrawal should always be managed appropriately by staff who are trained to recognise potential complications and to respond swiftly. So what does the science tell us about dependence? Well, in those with more severe alcohol use disorders, alcohol is afforded a worth greater than it actually deserves. As dependence takes hold, the rewards anticipated are not as great as hoped for. There is evidence that the patterns that develop in the behaviours associated with dependent drinking are habitual. They become hardwired in the brain, in the sense that there's changes in the way the neurons behave and talk to each other. There's changes in neurotransmitter function and availability. A neurotransmitter is simply a chemical messenger in the brain which allows the cells to talk to each other. In more severe alcohol use disorders, individuals become overwhelmed, they suffer negative emotional states. Judgment becomes impaired, insight becomes impaired, decision making becomes impaired. And even when detoxification takes place or drinking cessation happens, the problems persist. How does alcohol work? Well, if we reduce this to a really simple level, alcohol and other drugs actually cause the release of the neurotransmitter dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. It is more complicated than that, but I'll keep it simple. The nucleus accumbens is part of the brain's reward circuitry. Dopamine doesn't only signal for reward, it also signals for how important things are. This is something we call salience. And this value, this importance, is also applied to things which are important for survival. So independence, the dopamine theory says that the brain's survival mechanism begins to place a value on alcohol that it does not deserve. In fact, it's the opposite. So I could talk for an hour or two on the neuroscience of addiction. It's complicated, and this talk is reductive. I'm bringing it down to a simple level. But this slide helps us understand that it's a little bit more complicated than just dopamine, and it's a little bit more complicated than just the reward pathway. So we mentioned the reward pathway, the red area here, deep in the midbrain. And this part of the brain is part of our drive for survival, but also involves reward and salience. Memory and learning are important in addiction because the memories laid down when drinking dependently are sometimes called hypermemories. They're extra strong memories, and they're emotionally tied to the experience, the people, the sounds, the smell, the taste that are going on as people are drinking. And this is important when triggers and cues to drink are encountered. So we're talking about the purple area here, the amygdala and the hippocampus. The brain's also got its brakes, and the brakes protect us. In the severe end of alcohol use disorders, the brakes come off, which leads to disinhibition and dangerous behaviours. We also have our accelerator pedals. These are what motivates us. These are the green areas at the front of the brain. Motivation and drive are cited here. The foot comes off the gas for activities which were once important, things like hobbies, family, work, and the foot goes down for behaviours that are likely to result in drinking. The midbrain, where the reward circuit is located, has a very important function. It is really, really good at keeping us alive. I've used the example of reptiles here because simple creatures don't really have an equivalent to our frontal cortex, which expanded hugely as we evolved from our ancestors. Staying alive really is the prime driver for reptiles. We talk about the 4 F's of the midbrain, and these are related to survival imperatives that drive the midbrain. The first one is food. Snakes need to eat if they're going to survive. The next one is fight. Snakes have to be able to defend themselves if they're under attack. The next one is flight. Sometimes it's a better idea to slither away and get out of the danger. And the last one is fornication. I'm being polite here because it's much more primitive than that. It's about keeping the species going, keeping the species alive. We have exactly the same drives in our midbrain, but obviously we are more evolved than snakes. As we evolved, we clung on to our midbrain because the primitive survival instincts it generates are still really good value in keeping us alive. If there's a threat, our midbrain prepares us for fight or flight. But a little bit differently from snakes, our forebrain governs our response. So in humans, our forebrains are where we think. We weigh up our needs. We make healthy decisions there. And these normally govern the primitive instincts of the midbrain. We don't run away or attack every time we're threatened. We think about the best options. But the evidence suggests that in alcohol dependence, this ability to govern and discern becomes significantly impaired. In the dopamine theory of addiction, the overwhelmed midbrain, overstimulated by dopamine release, begins to tag the use of alcohol with a salience and importance that it does not deserve. And indeed, it's an importance at a survival level. So the emboldened midbrain's primitive instincts and drives begin to call the shots over the logical, decision-making, insightful part of the brain. Now, there is evidence to back up this theory. This is one of the earliest pieces of evidence which was done on poor little rats and mice in laboratory conditions. And in this experiment, this rat has a tiny electrode into its midbrain, and if an electric current is switched on, then there is a huge release of dopamine in the rat's midbrain. And the rat in this experiment can stimulate that by pressing the lever which clicks on this tiny electrical current. And in these experiments, the mice and rats would press the lever above all other rewards. So they could be offered water to drink, they weren't interested. Food to eat, they weren't interested. Attractive rats to have sex with, they weren't interested. In fact, they continued to press the lever until they died. And we believe this is a proxy for what happens in human beings when they get dependent on alcohol. So the normal survival imperatives, the ones that are wired into us and help keep us alive, begin to become trumped by alcohol, because alcohol tells the midbrain through excessive dopamine release that alcohol is more important than anything else. As the disorder worsens, alcohol begins to move up the hierarchy, until finally it sits at the top of the hierarchy and dependence becomes established. In some sense, the midbrain's mechanisms begin to tag alcohol with a survival value that it does not deserve, and it becomes the midbrain's response to stressors, which would normally lead to different kinds of solutions. I want to touch on these 5 elements relating to dependence, which I think are really important in understanding the more severe end of alcohol use disorders, and the group most likely to find itself in the deepest trouble. These are genetics, the midbrain, reward and salience, a little bit more about that, why memory is important, how the stress system increases risk, and why at the end of the day choice becomes impaired, making it very difficult to think your way out of alcohol dependence. Population studies, twin studies, adoption studies, and an improved understanding of genetics mean we can confidently say that genes play a major role in alcohol use disorder, accounting for as much as 50% of the risk of developing an alcohol use disorder. There is no single gene coding for risk, it's the result of a combination of many genes. But the bottom line is, we're not all born with the same risk. Genes influence how alcohol is processed in the body, how our brains respond, and how much of a risk taker we are. These are all things that increase our individual vulnerability to alcohol use disorder. This is complicated though, because genes and the environment interact, and how we experience life, particularly childhood and the environment we find ourselves in socially, and the effect and processing of stress and trauma have powerful influences on risk. Dopamine is an interesting neurotransmitter. It codes for lots of different things, but what we're talking about pleasure and reward, it's more about desire than it is about pleasure. It's more about wanting than it is about liking. It's also part of the way our brains learn, and it's part of our motivation system. So it too is complicated, but it's key to what goes wrong in alcohol use disorders. So dopamine itself is a molecule that carries a message. It's a neurotransmitter. The brain needs a way of picking that message up. It does this through receptors. It's a bit like an old-fashioned television aerial. That if you've got a TV but it doesn't have a TV aerial, then it's not going to pick up the signal. And in order to pick up the dopamine molecules, the brain also needs receptors. If you look at this, these 2 scans, we have a normal brain on the left-hand side and someone who is dependent on methamphetamine, a very potent kind of amphetamine, on the right-hand side. And in the comparison, you can see there are far fewer dopamine receptors in the right-hand slide. In this person, the number of dopamine receptors is greatly reduced. And if we look at this across different sorts of substances, including alcohol, you can see the normal brains on the left-hand column, and on the right-hand column, we can see for cocaine, methamphetamine, alcohol, and heroin, a reduction in dopamine receptor availability. So what does that actually mean in day-to-day life? Well, what we think it means for an individual is a lack of capacity to feel normal pleasure. This is what the psychiatrists call anhedonia. And what this really means is that normal kind of fun activities don't really do it for you anymore. Things like hobbies, time with your family, going out for a nice meal, going to see the latest blockbuster in the cinema. Those fewer receptors that result from dependent drinking can really only be flooded by heavy drinking, which releases enough dopamine to get a little bit of a blip on the pleasure radar. All the other things that used to do it no longer do it because they're not releasing enough dopamine.
I want to talk about another neurotransmitter, and it's called glutamate. It's important in alcohol use disorders. It's the chemical of memory formation, and like dopamine, more of it's released when people are drinking who have alcohol use disorders. It means that the memories that are laid down whilst drinking are stronger. They're sometimes called hypermemories. It's not just the pleasure that's laid down as a memory, but the smells, the music, the company, the setting you're in are all laid down as powerful memories with a strong emotional component. And when people are back in a similar situation to when those memories were laid down, they can be triggered, the memories can be triggered. Being with the same people, listening to the same music in a strong way that is associated with drinking and increases the risk of returning to drinking after a period of abstinence.
There's a conversation goes on between the dopamine neurons in the nucleus accumbens, the reward circuitry, and the glutamate neurons in the frontal cortex and the prefrontal cortex, the front of the brain, which is where they're located. When people are drinking in a dependent fashion, drinking heavily, dopamine says, because it's a chemical of salience, says, this is important, remember this, and sends a signal up to the front of the brain. And glutamate says, okay, I'm going to lay this down as an important memory. But it also says, go ahead, because glutamate is a permission-giving neurotransmitter. It takes the brakes off and allows people to continue to drink. The next system I want to mention is our stress system in the midbrain. Now, stress is an important part of keeping us alive. It's good sometimes to be stressed, particularly when we're in dangerous situations. When we're under threat, the midbrain is preparing us for survival. Now, in dependence, the midbrain has associated alcohol with having a survival value, even though it doesn't deserve that value. And it makes sense that the midbrain activates and drives the person with alcohol use disorder to drink when that person is under threat. And it's got a secret weapon that it uses to do that. That secret weapon is craving. When faced with enough stress, someone who has a severe alcohol use disorder is much more likely to drink. But triggers and cues are also precipitants to drinking again. And the last of the issues I want to touch on relates to the issue of impairment of capacity to make healthy choices. For most of us who are working at the sharp end, whether that's in criminal justice or in treatment, it's clear that most people we're seeing who are at the severe end of the spectrum of alcohol use disorders have made many unhealthy choices, even when they're clearly not unintelligent. Scans of the activity and function of the brain have helped shed some light on this. Based on brain scans, the phenomenon of brain frontal hyperfunctionality, or in simple language, reduced function of the front part of the brain, is pretty universal in dependent drinkers. And it's thought that this impairment leads to the lack of judgment, poor decision making, and loss of insight that characterizes severe alcohol use disorders. This is much more akin to a dial than a switch. In other words, there are degrees of impairment, and this impairment is dynamic over time and circumstance. So the changes that can occur in the brains of people who have suffered emotional trauma, often happens as children, seem to cause long-lasting effects, particularly in the areas of the brain that process emotions. And there are similar deficits found in people who are dependent on substances. In practice, this means that such individuals can be hypervigilant, they can be fearing danger when danger does not exist, and they can have difficulty managing stressful situations because they feel overwhelmed. When you've got this toxic mix of alcohol use disorder and a background of trauma, there's a double whammy for people that are affected.
So what about the behaviours associated with alcohol use disorder? Why are they so difficult to change? At its most simple level, the reason is that the bit of the brain that we would normally use to figure out how to get out of the hole that we're in becomes so impaired that it can't do that. And the powerful primitive drive to drink can't be easily countered. Even in the face of accumulating negative consequences, it becomes very, very, very difficult for people to stop. These changes become hardwired. Some people respond really badly to interventions. You can see defensiveness and hostility sometimes. These are normal reactions. When someone's trying to take away your solution to life, it's normal to be defensive about it. In addition, lots of people who suffer from alcohol use disorders are aware at some level that their behaviour is not how they want it to be. And defensiveness is a protective mechanism around that. What about relapse? Well, we know that stress triggers the survival part of the brain. The survival part of the brain has labelled alcohol as having some kind of survival value, so when stress gets bad enough, the answer is to go to drink. And the interaction between trauma and stress and alcohol use disorder makes a really toxic mix. Okay, summarising all of it, choice is impaired. So people with alcohol use disorder, particularly people with alcohol dependence, need help. And there's no doubt that the behaviours associated with alcohol use disorder can be unpleasant, they can be hugely counterproductive, they can be difficult to be around, but those are symptoms of a well understood and well studied condition. In medicine, we do not punish people for having symptoms of the condition we're trying to treat. We need to adopt an understanding and compassionate response. Of course, we sometimes need boundaries, but we also need compassion. Well, we know that treatment's effective. There's a whole other talk on treatment for alcohol use disorders. A combination of support and interventions, things like motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioural therapy, community treatment, residential rehab, medication, all of these can have a positive impact. Managing cues and triggers, helping people understand the danger of going back into situations where they used to drink or with people they used to drink with. Relapse prevention work can help tackle some of that. This can be quite effective. Finding new ways to manage stress is hugely important, and one of the ways that we can do that is by helping people connect up to recovery resources in the community. A study done in the United States has shown that simply the addition of one sober person to the social network of someone who has alcohol dependence reduces relapse rates by 27% in the following year. If I could get anything like that kind of impact from prescribing medication, I would be delighted, but we can't. So social interventions for alcohol use disorder have got a huge part to play. Think about mutual aid and the evidence for mutual aid. Alcoholics Anonymous is the largest mutual aid group for support for people with alcohol dependence anywhere in the world. There are other groups like Smart Recovery, which are likely to be effective too. The Cochrane Review of 2020, Cochrane is a scientific and academic body which looks at the evidence for things. It only uses studies of the highest level of evidence, and it looked at Alcoholics Anonymous and its impact in 2020, and it found that Alcoholics Anonymous was nearly always found to be more effective than psychotherapy in achieving abstinence. That includes things like cognitive behavioural therapy, which we know is effective. And members of Alcoholics Anonymous had a 20 to 60% better abstinence rate than people in other sorts of treatments. And not only that, Alcoholics Anonymous membership was associated with reduced mental health costs of around £8,300 per person. And if you add into that savings from criminal justice costs and from physical health costs, we're looking at significant savings. And yet, mutual aid is probably one of our most underused resources in addiction treatment and support. John Kelly, the American researcher, says in addictions, mutual aid is the closest thing we have to a free lunch, and yet we're not using that free lunch enough. Supporting people with alcohol use disorders, and particularly dependence, into recovery, we need to remember that journeys are rarely linear. We need to see the big picture over time. The truth is that most people with dependence will need more than one attempt to get well again. And some people will need many attempts. People respond well to relationship. There's plenty of scientific evidence to show that the quality of the relationship in support and treatment services is the strongest predictor of outcomes. Here's some good news. We'll go back to the brain science for a minute or two, at least for those achieving an abstinent recovery. Let's just ignore the scans on the right column and look at the scans on the left. We have the normal brain at the top, plenty of dopamine receptors there, the red and orange colours. Concentrations are really good. This person goes to see that blockbuster movie and loves it. The next scan is someone who's dependent on methamphetamine, who has almost no red and orange areas in the scan. This person is not getting normal pleasure from things which would normally be pleasurable. And then the same person, 2 years down the line, we can see an almost complete restoration of dopamine receptor availability. This person is now beginning to enjoy those normal things in life again. So this is good news. This is what happens to people over time, but it doesn't happen overnight. People have to be supported over quite a long period of time to get back to normal functioning and the ability to enjoy normal things. And just on that hopeful note, there's good news from the research on addiction recovery over time. We're getting better at looking at journeys over much longer periods of time. The research tells us that more than 60% of people with an alcohol use disorder can expect a long-lasting remission from that over time. And although people might have to have more than that one episode of treatment, some people having multiple episodes of treatment, every intervention, every contact with people, whether we are professionals or people that care about them, is an opportunity to introduce hope and to introduce the support that's going to help them move forward. Every time we do something like that, their capacity to get better and to recover increases.